In Yu-Gi-Oh!, the standby phase is usually reserved for miscellaneous effects and maintenance costs. And so in this video, we'll go over some of the worst cards with effects that trigger during the standby phase. And at number 10, we have Inspection. This is a continuous spell card with the effect that during your opponent's standby phase, you can pay 500 life points to look at one random card in their hand. Now, hand knowledge isn't a terrible thing by any standards, but it's never something you want to dedicate a whole card to with no additional benefits. Cards like Aqua Dolphin and Trap Dust Shoot have seen play because they give you hand information plus a hand rip. However, Inspection is the only card on this list that has actually had a niche in a semi-competitive deck back in the day, that being Last Turn OTK. Inspection used to be able to be activated any number of times during the standby phase, allowing you to drop your life points way down below 1000 by paying its cost several times. This enabled you to activate Last Turn as soon as possible, fulfilling a similar role to Wall of Revealing Light. And then you'd be able to win the duel by having something else like Jiaojin the Spiritualist on the field as well. Somewhere along the years, Inspection got a ruling change that made its effect a hard once per turn, despite its card text not stating so. Granted, this was ages after Last Turn itself got banned, so it's not like Inspection was being used anyway. Still, for a card that actually saw play in an old school combo deck, this card gets only the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Curse of Fiend. This is a normal spell card that can only be activated during your standby phase, and its effect is that it changes the battle position of all monsters on the field, and then you can't change them except with a card effect for the rest of this turn. Curse of Fiend is one of the weirdest spell cards printed in Yu-Gi-Oh!, since obviously you can only activate normal spell cards in your main phase since they're spell speed 1. But, well, since card effects override game mechanics, you can activate this during your standby phase if you set it first. It doesn't even behave like a quick play spell, but rather as a trap. That's how they ruled this card back then. This card is not only worse than spells, since you need to wait a turn to use it, but it's also worse than traps because you can't even use it during your opponent's turn. To top it all off, this card goes on to restrict the battle positions from being changed except by card effects for the rest of the turn. And since it must be activated during your standby phase, you will be the only one hindered by this. The only thing weirder than Curse of Fiend working like it does is the fact that someone thought it needed a drawback to balance it out as well. And at number 8, we have Return Zombie. This is a dark zombie monster who's level 4 with 1000 attack and 1600 defense. It has the effect that during the standby phase, you can pay 500 life points to add this card from your graveyard to your hand as long as your hand is empty. If you didn't know, the standby phase happens immediately after your draw phase, so you'll have to find a way to lose the card you drew somehow. Now, that isn't the hardest thing in the world. When this card was released, there were actually many chainable traps that had discard cost and were seeing heavy play. In addition, Reckless Greed would prevent you from drawing for the turn entirely and could also fulfill the same role. Cards like Return Zombie, which would get you a free resource during even your standby phase, were actually massively popular at around the time it was released too, with Pre-Errata Sinister Serpent being a mainstay in older formats until it was eventually replaced with Treeborn Frog. With all that said, why is Return Zombie on this list? Well, because it's unequivocally worse than the alternatives you had. The setup it needed wasn't that hard, but what made Serpent and the Frog so good was how easily accessible they were once you had them set up. Neither of those cards would rot in your graveyard doing nothing like Return Zombie most likely will. And at number 7, we have Malice Ascendant. This is a level 4 dark zombie monster with 700 attack, and it has the effect that during each of your opponent's standby phases, you can mill a card from their deck for each copy of Malice Ascendant you have in your graveyard. So if you just normal summon this card on your first turn, it'll have no effect whatsoever. And that's probably the best this card can be. Milling cards from your opponent's deck has never really been a good effect, since even by the time this card was released, cards in the graveyard were already being used as a resource. There isn't any point in milling your opponent unless you can deck them out in a reasonable amount of time. In this aspect, this card was heavily outclassed by Needleworm and Morphing Jar, who'd milled 5 cards compared to this card's 2 with the exorbitant setup. Eventually, once the Mayakashi cards were released, people would go and play the zombie mill that milled 2 cards and another gimmicky deck out strategy. But that was with the even older soul-absorbing Bone Tower. Outside of these kinds of decks, there were some cards that milled your opponent that did see play, but always because they incidentally did it, never as the main feature. If anything, these effects were seen as a downside to using them. You can tell Malice Ascendant is bad when it asks you to waste additional resources for an effect that most people would avoid using if possible. And at number 6, we have Patrol Robo. This monster is a level 3 Earth Machine monster with 1100 attack, and its effect is that during each of your standby phases, you can look at one face-down card on your opponent's field. Effects that just give you field knowledge have never really seen play. Knowing what your opponent has face down is something that's easier to deduce than knowing what's in their hand, especially in longer games. For example, if your opponent has used Charge the Light Brigade to search Raikou earlier this turn, you can probably tell that his face-down card is that card. But ultimately, even if you actually have no idea what your opponent has, interacting with cards on the board is much easier than with cards in the hand. Why would you waste a card just to know what your opponent has when you could instead be using a card to get rid of it, like Dark Hole or Lightning Storm? Even in the context of this being a really old card, it was given a tiny stat line, which makes it unlikely it'll survive until your next turn to get its effect off, and would soon be power crept by a monster that has seen just as much play as itself. And at number 5, we have Pumpking, the King of Ghosts. This is a level 6 dark zombie monster with 1800 attack and has 2 effects. First is it gains 100 attack if Castle of Dark Illusions is face up on the field, and then as long as the castle remains face up on the field, this card will further gain 100 attack and defense during each of your standby phases, but this effect itself turns off after the 4th time you activate it. Before we go any further, Castle of Dark Illusions is a flip monster who increases the stats of all zombie monsters in the field by 200 on flip, and then by a further 200 every standby phase. These two are very old cards, of course, having come out during the second set of Yugioh in the TCG, and their age really shows. They were heavily outclassed in every aspect even upon release. These cards want you to play and protect the castle strategy between themselves, despite coming out alongside some of the best removal spells of all time. As a tribute monster, Pumpking paled in comparison to Summon Skull of this same set, who would have higher stats on Summon than if it happened to live through many standby phases. And when it came to his partner in time, you'd be hard-pressed to choose Castle for a flip monster over Maneater Bug or Magician of Faith. And at number 4, we have Battle Scarred. This is a continuous trap which requires you to target an Archfiend monster you control to activate it. During each of your standby phases, if that monster would pay life points for its maintenance effect, your opponent has to pay that much as well. Additionally, if this card is destroyed, your monster gets destroyed as well. Archfiends are one of the oldest archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it has had multiple playable cards throughout the years. Even their spell and trap card support has been quite decent, with Archfiend Palabyrinth seen playing Infernity decks at some point, who also had an Archfiend monster. Battle Scarred wouldn't work with a single of these cards, since none of the good Archfiends actually have a life point cost during the standby phase. You see, Battle Scarred was meant to work with the Chess Archfiends, a really small subsection of the archetype whose most notable trait was having a 2k normal summonable beater back then. You'd have a much better reward for playing Archfiends if you had just an old Falling Down instead, which is a snatch steal as long as you control one. It wouldn't make your Archfiend monsters die to MST like Battle Scarred does either. Throughout the years, they have released more Archfiend cards with a life point standby phase cost, but none that were actually good enough to see play, not by themselves and much less with Battle Scarred. And at number 3, we have Princess Pikeru. This is a level 4 light spellcaster monster with 2000 attack. It cannot be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned with Trial of the Princess. Its effect lets you gain 800 life points for each monster you control during your standby phase. Princess Pikeru's effect isn't that bad at first glance, but begs up for it by being really hard to get out. To summon it, you need its base form, White Magician Pikeru equipped with Trial of the Princess, an equip spell which is exclusive to the Pikeru and Kurin, and increases their attack by 800 points. Then, if your Pikeru beats over a level 5 or higher monster by battle, you can finally special summon Princess Pikeru from your deck. So you need a specific low-statted level 2 monster equipped with a low-power equip spell. Having these two requirements would be bad enough, but requiring you to beat over a level 5 monster brings it over the top. The only thing you could reasonably beat over when Pikeru came out would be an Air Knight Parshath, a one-of in a meta filled with Chaos Sorcerers and Cyber Dragons. And yes, this card asked you for this much setup for a 2k beater in a meta where Cyber Dragon existed and was in every deck. Pikeru is on this list over its dark counterpart in Princess Kuran because burn effects are generally more impactful than life point gain. Kuran's 600 burn could win you the duel in very specific situations, which is something Pikeru's effect could never do. And at number 2, we have Senri Eye. This is a continuous spell with the effect that during each of your standby phases, you can pay 100 life points to look at the card on top of your opponent's deck. So far, we've seen cards that are bad because they just give you hand information or field information. However, Senri Eye manages to be worse than both of these. The card on top of your opponent's deck doesn't affect the current game state in any way. To make matters worse, Senri works only during your standby phase. So not only is this effect bad, you won't even see your opponent's top deck until 2 turns after you activate it. There's not even a guarantee their top deck will remain the same because they could just go into their deck during their turn with their cards. There have been a few cards that have seen play that would allow you to know your opponent's top deck, but these cards allowed you to actually give your opponent a bad top deck. The only other instance of a card like this being played was Convulsion of Nature in Reversal Quiz FTKs. But even in that deck, the effect of knowing your opponent's next card, which it actually did better since you weren't running the risk of ever losing information, was just a small bonus. The real utility was in having a spell that could be bounced back with Giant Trunade to generate a lot of counters for Royal Magical Library, while comboing with Archfiend's Oath. Meanwhile, Senri's Eye's best use is probably as the worst, slowest spiral combo enabler in the game. And finally, at number 1, we've got Germ Infection. This is an equip spell that says the attack of a non-machine type monster equipped with this card is decreased by 300 points during each of its standby phases. As you could probably notice by the non-machine part, this card came from a very weird time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. But even inside this sub-theme of cards that don't affect machines, Germ Infection is not even the best equip spell of the bunch. Despite what its text makes it sound like, it actually only reduces the monster's stats during your own standby phase. So upon equipping it to an opponent's monster, they'll still get a full turn of using it with its original attack. And then even after that, a 300 decrease is as bad as it gets. Even as far back as when this card is released, why use such a small debuff to beat over something when you could just boost yourself for way more? There was already no reason to run this card back in 2002, but of course it'd only get worse with time. Shattered Axe offers the same effect but stronger and on a trap card, which is actually better in this case since you don't have to let your opponent know he will get an attack decrease 2 turns in advance. Not to mention the plethora of other stat reducing equip spells that, while still too bad to see competitive play, still put Germ Infection to shame, such as Dark World Shackles and Curse Armaments. Even if this card happens to be the most searchable card in this list, due to it being an equip spell, you wouldn't want to have this card in your deck, much less in your hand. Germ Infection is probably the closest you can get to a spell doing nothing as you can in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and this is why it's by far the worst card of these 10. Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other terrible standby effects that we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.